So our last session today is on just war, just peace, and nonviolence. And we have some wonderful panelists to be part of our discussion here today. We have a little bit of an alumni association of the former directors of the Office of International Justice and Peace at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Both Jerry Powers and Steve Kolecki were successors to Drew in that role at the U.S. Catholic Bishops Conference. And not to be left out in any way, we have Lori Johnston from Emmanuel College, and all of us have also worked together on the Catholic Peace Building Network, one of the conveners, co-sponsors here today with the Berkeley Center, and certainly one of the centers through which Drew's work ran. We are going to following in John Carr's lovely example of being more discussion and question-based. That's going to be our modus operandi in our conversation here today. So we'll start out with some questions among the panelists, among the folks up here, and then we'll, of course, invite it open for questions with all of you. I do apologize for having to interrupt what I'm sure are some very fruitful conversations, but it won't be the last chance. We'll then go for break and lunch and have a lot more opportunity to continue the conversations that we were having on break. We've been discussing throughout the last 2 days all the different areas of Drew's work, but one common theme that moves through it are how he's holding these issues of justice and peace together. And I wonder, Steve, some of the narrative regarding Catholic teaching on issues of war and peace has been that there's been a lot of change. And I wonder, do you see it that way, or do you see some continuity through Catholic tradition? What's your take on the development of Catholic tradition on war, peace, and nonviolence?
Sure. Well, there's been change and continuity, right? There's been change and continuity because there's been development. And today's panel on just war, just peace, and nonviolence in many ways goes to the heart of Father Drew's legacy. The Church's teaching on war and peace constantly develops in response to new challenges in our world. It has a certain trajectory. And the beautiful thing about Drew is he was very active in pushing forward that trajectory of the Church's teaching, narrowing the use of force, expanding the building of peace through nonviolence. I believe Drew believed that just war and the nonviolence traditions are not entirely incompatible. The true traditions are certainly in tension, and it can be a really healthy tension. The U.S. bishops explored this tension in their pastoral reflection of 1993 on the harvest of justice is sown in peace. Similarly, much more recently, in 2017, in his World Day of Peace message, Pope Francis wrote, and I quote, "Peace building through active nonviolence is the necessary and natural complement to the Church's continuing efforts to limit the use of force by the application of moral norms." I think too often the term a just war is misunderstood, and it's certainly often misused. Just war does not mean that everything is permissible in the use of force to protect human lives. For this reason, I personally prefer to speak of the just use of force or of just defense, because there have to be moral limits on the use of force, and Drew was very strong on that. At the same time, nonviolence doesn't mean a non-resistance to evil or injustice. As Pope Francis reminds us, nonviolence is sometimes taken to mean surrender or lack of involvement in passivity, but this is not the case. The U.S. bishops, back in their pastoral letter of 93, and also more recently in Pope Francis's 2017 peace message, they lift up examples of how nonviolence has been incredibly effective. Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Pope Francis lifted up the role of women in particular, noting their work in Liberia. So Drew on both of the traditions in ways that increased the tension and moved things forward. You know, the goal of both the nonviolence tradition and the just war tradition at its best is to reduce violence in the world. They both begin with a strong presumption against the use of force. They both believe that peace is more than the absence of war. So there's a certain complementarity between the traditions, and particularly the nonviolence tradition laying out many more options before the use of force can even be considered, if force is to truly be a last resort. So, and maybe the thing I'll end on is something, Marianne, that the just peace. That's a better term than just war, really, because because peace is never achieved through force of arms, ultimately. That's a short-term project to maybe correct an injustice or to protect innocent people. But the long-term project is to build peace, and that requires human development, respect for human rights. And I think that's what Drew was all about.
Jerry, you want to follow up on this thread about the development of the teaching and maybe continue it from the development to the application?
So I've known Drew since 1982 when I took a course from him at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, and then I took a second course in the spring from him. And I always considered him to be not only the best teacher I had, but the toughest grader. And for a teacher, that's high praise to say they're both toughest grader and the best teacher. And so about 10 years ago, I tried to map the development of what the U.S. bishops have said on war and peace since the Peace Pastoral in 1983 for the U.S. Catholic historian. And I sent the draft to Drew to look at, and he came back to me and with a point-by-point critique. I felt like I was back in one of his classes, of my lack of sufficient attention to the bishop's approach to nonviolence, their work in Haiti, and a host of other issues that he thought I had missed. So he concluded, quote, "Well, this is why people write history and why it can't be trusted. Still, this is a major contribution." So you can ignore everything I'm about to say about Drew's history, because you can be sure it can't be trusted. But one thing Drew was very proud of, all the statements on war and peace he helped draft the bishops wrote when he was at the bishops' conference. The Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace, I think, was the one he was most proud of. And that's because that was the major document the bishops issued after the Cold War that provided a moral vision and a moral framework for a post-Cold War order. When, as you remember, everything was on the table. We really were, President Bush, was talking about a new world order. And so it really it wasn't a tabula rasa, but it was really an exciting time to think big thoughts. And the Harvest of Justice addressed a lot of important issues. But one part that he was particularly proud of, and he drafted this section, we kind of co-authored it with John Carr and then 400 bishops. But he was particularly proud of this quote, and he often cited it, and that was on nonviolence, to follow up on Steve's point. And the bishop said that one must ask, in light of recent history, whether nonviolence should be restricted to personal commitments or whether it also should have a place in the public order with the tradition of justified and limited war. And then about 10 years later, when Drew was working with the International Catholic Mennonite Dialogue and helped draft the report of that dialogue, a report which was reviewed by the Holy See before it was issued, they said something very, very similar about the Catholic approach to nonviolence, that it had to be implemented in public policies. It wasn't just a personal option. And that was a major development of the tradition, because in the Peace Pastoral in 1983, for example, the bishops reiterated the Second Vatican Council's teaching, which was that nonviolence was an important part, one of the two traditions of the ethics of war and peace in the Catholic tradition. But nonviolence was maybe a personal vocation, but it wasn't something for states, because states had an obligation as a last resort when necessary to use limited force to defend the common good. So Drew is very proud of that development that where we talked about nonviolence as part of the public obligation. It didn't exclude the limited use of force when necessary, but it was a move that he was very proud of.
Before I turn to Lori, though, I'm just going to ask you to follow up, Jerry. So we've heard about the expansion of the prominence of nonviolence in Catholic teaching, but Drew also maintained that he was a strict adherent to the just war tradition. And sometimes that, became difficult in the public sphere, as was evident in the debates before the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. I wonder if you can bring us back to that discussion of what was at stake there for the strict kind of versus the more permissive takes on just war tradition and this application to the war in Iraq.
So because of the growing importance of nonviolence, both theoretically and practically, Drew actually talked about, he said that we shouldn't just talk about the just war tradition, but we should talk about the nonviolence / just war tradition. So he kind of put them together as one instead of talking about them as complementary but distinct traditions. But he said that he thought that one of the biggest threats to the church's nonviolence just war tradition came from those who wanted to return to a more traditional approach that saw just war as a theory of statecraft. And David Hallenbach talked about this in some detail yesterday. But George Weigel, Michael Novak, and James Turner Johnson are three of the major proponents of this view. And they, as David mentioned yesterday, they argued that the bishops had taken the church in general, bishops of the United States in particular, had taken a highly restrictive interpretation of the just war tradition, which began with the presumption against war instead of the presumption what it should begin with, which is a presumption for justice. And therefore the bishops have become functionally pacifist. And Drew saw that argument, that this restrictive approach to just war, which the church had adopted in the 20th century, that was a mistaken move and somehow abandonment of the tradition. He saw that as the greatest threat. And I think the Iraq War was Exhibit A on why that was a threat. And that that permissive interpretation of the Weigels, Novak at that time was U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, and James Turner Johnson and others, that really was a real threat to the tradition. So you might remember that one of the justifications, not the only justification of the Iraq War, but one of the justifications put forward was a preventive war justification. It was in the 2002 National Security Strategy document, and George Bush, former President George Bush, still talks about that war was justified because there was a gathering danger, that Iraq represented a gathering danger because of the weapons of mass destruction, the ties to terrorists, and the fact that he was a serial aggressor in a rogue regime. The bishops were, and the Vatican and Drew were apoplectic for the most part about that view because it was such an assault on the restrictive approach to the just war tradition. It exploded just cause. Instead of just cause being a fairly objective criterion of defense against ongoing aggression, which is in the Catechism, just cause became a highly subjective criterion that was dependent upon the nature of the regime, a rogue regime, and speculation about what that rogue regime might threaten to do in the future because they might have weapons of mass destruction or ties to terrorists. And so they, as George Weigel said, Iraq was aggression waiting to happen. Well, no, just cause becomes meaningless if aggression waiting to happen becomes the definition of just cause. It also, it becomes very speculative because who knows what's going to happen if it's just a gathering danger. It's not even an imminent danger, it's a gathering danger. And it's also bad precedent for international affairs. The fact that Putin is now using Iraq as a precedent for his preventive war against Ukraine, it just shows you why this is not a principle that you want to universalize. And therefore, it becomes a principle of might makes right. And the National Security Strategy of 2002 is quite explicit about this, that you needed U.S. hegemony, military, political, and economic hegemony, in order for this principle to work. And finally, preventive wars are wars of occupation, and Drew wrote a lot about this, the jus post bellum question. And wars of occupation, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, don't go very well most of the time.
Yes, it's not only bad morality, it's bad policy. And we have a good deal of social science backing up the moral claims you're making that preventive wars don't work out very well. I would refer you to some wonderful articles Jerry has written on this in the past on the problems of that expansion, that permissive use of force, preventive war. Very, very rich. I want to turn now to Lori, professor of social ethics and religion at Emmanuel College, but the other and author of numerous books on this topic. But one of the other hats that you wear is a leader in the peace organization and community of San Egidio. And one of Drew's through lines for how he saw this narrative developing was it wasn't just a matter of the magisterium changing their documents, but it was a matter of what the church was doing in conflict zones around the world that was leading to greater moral discernment and moving this narrative. So I wonder if you can tell us a bit about how you see the influence of San Egidio in both this development of the Catholics' tradition on war and peace, but also, specifically some of the relationships between San Egidio and certainly Pope Francis, of course, is more in the headlines today, but that was true even in prior popes.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thanks, Fran. So San Egidio is a relatively young organization, and I think all of us as teachers and mentors appreciate the importance for young people of being recognized, of being told, okay, you're on the right track, and so as San Egidio has developed as an organization and taken on a bigger role in different forms of peace work, that those forms of recognition have been really helpful. And Drew is one of those whose recognition has meant a lot, partly because he was, I think, sensitive early on to the possibilities of what's now being called Track 2 diplomacy, and was just beginning to be called that really when San Egidio came to the United States, met with Drew, among others. He understood the complexity of what it means to try to make peace in this world that is no longer just billiard ball nation states, right? But where civil society has an important role to play. And trying to play that role in new and creative ways as San Egidio, that was helpful. This actually also connects a little bit to what Jerry was just saying, and I just want to add one thing about that whole debate about the war in Iraq. One argument that George Weigel made was that the whole question should be left up to the politicians, and that the U.S. bishops had no role to play in what was a question of sort of political prudence. And of course, Drew wisely pushed back on that and said, no, it's really important for there to be moral and ethical voices in the political sphere, and for politicians to be hearing those voices loud and clear. And in many ways, I think the community of San Egidio's approach to peace work has often been, let's try to figure out how to help politicians do what they ought to be doing. And that approach comes very much from the influence of, really of the Vatican. So most of the members of Sant'Egidio who've been most involved in diplomatic negotiations really kind of cut their teeth under the influence of Vatican diplomacy. We don't always work in collaboration with the Vatican, certainly not officially anyway, but there's a very strong influence there in the modus operandi. So there are, of course, many different ways, as you've highlighted, that Catholic organizations are involved in peace building at all levels, right? But Sant'Egidio has tended to operate at a pretty high level, engaging primarily with political leaders, and recognizing that there's a need to create spaces where they can speak freely, away from the attention of the media, but even away from the attention of official diplomatic channels, which is why this track 2 model can be really useful. You had asked me a little bit about how Sant'Egidio has been influenced by Pope Francis, has been influenced by Pope John Paul II, and maybe mutually influenced. And I think there are a lot of different ways in which you could see Sant'Egidio and Pope Francis as co-conspirators, perhaps, partly because of a taste for the symbolic gesture that has an impact. So, for instance, many folks might remember when Pope Francis, early in his papacy, flew to Crete, I think it was, to visit refugee camps, and then brought several refugees back on the papal airplane. So that was all arranged by Sant'Egidio. It was not a whim of the Pope, although certainly it had an effect of surprising folks, which was lovely. Or when Pope Francis wanted to open a homeless shelter, actually at St. Peter's, basically in the Vatican, he called on Sant'Egidio to make it happen. And even more recently, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I don't know if you remember, but the very next morning, Pope Francis actually went and knocked on the door of the Russian embassy in Rome. And that was after a conversation with some folks in Sant'Egidio about what now? What now? What do we do? Let's go knock on the door. A symbolic gesture, certainly, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have impact at the same time.
Today's scripture readings are I stand and knock at the door. So a very direct relationship with our heritage, as well as a means of expanding the discussion and the dialogue. This is a beautiful way of pointing out the very many levels, as Laurie was just saying, at which Catholic peace building can occur, with grassroots movements like Pax Christi, like Sant'Egidio, like so many others, Caritas, Relief and Development Organizations, CRS, the official channels of the Bishops' Conference, and Laurie, you mentioned the Vatican diplomatic channels, and Jerry's exactly right. In the run-up to the Iraq War, all of those channels were mobilized simultaneously, trying to raise alarms and raise concerns, and it was a very polarizing political moment because there was not a lot of political outcry against that, certainly in terms of members of Congress. So I recall the bishops laying out in great detail all of the adverse consequences that would flow from the invasion, which proved absolutely prescient, and voices in the military who were raising those same concerns. And the Holy See, the Apostolic Nuncio, bringing a letter directly to George Bush from the Pope, and the real concern that in that meeting with President Bush that he just set the letter aside, didn't even look at it. But this is a great way of showing the different levels of the church and ways in which they can mobilize on building a just peace. Jerry, for Drew's orientation and description of himself as a strict just war theorist and also as a just peace practitioner, he also embraced expansion of ideas of the responsibility to protect, particularly out of experiences of humanitarian intervention. And I wonder if you could unpack a bit of that part of the development of the tradition.
So another reason why it's not helpful to think of the church's position, Drew's position, as functionally pacifist is precisely the debate over humanitarian intervention, and that turned into responsibility to protect. They're not the same thing, but I'm going to, for the moment, talk about them as if they're the same thing. But Drew and I wrote an article, did a co-authored article on humanitarian intervention in the late 90s, before the responsibility to protect principles started to emerge. And we tried to make we were building on what Pope John Paul II said and what the U.S. bishops said in the Harvest of Justice, the Stone of Peace, about that in some cases, when whole populations are at risk due to genocide or starvation or ethnic cleansing or something like that, the international community had not only a right of humanitarian intervention, which was controversial enough, but had a duty of humanitarian intervention. So we tried to think about that ethically and expand on that, and Drew continued to do that up until very recently. I just read an article of his from a couple of years ago where he talked extensively about the responsibility to protect, now that that's been in operation for quite some time and accepted as an international law, international principle. But he would, a number of points that he liked to raise about humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect. One was the need to look at the different kinds of interventions. And this anticipated, we talked about this in the late 90s, but this anticipated the responsibility to protect, which says that the responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention is not primarily about military intervention, which is how it was typically talked about in the international law journals and in the ethics journals well into the 90s. So the focus was always on military intervention and whether that could be unilateral or multilateral, but it was military intervention of a war-fighting type. And that is one form of humanitarian intervention, but it's not the only form and not necessarily the best form of intervention. And so Drew would like to talk about the varieties of interventions that you need to think about, starting with the nonviolent or diplomatic kinds of interventions. And they're interventions because they're against the will of the state in question, the state that's violating human rights or something. But there are lots of nonviolent ways you can intervene, from war crimes indictments, which the ICC has undertaken, to groups like Catholic Relief Services or governments providing humanitarian aid on the territory of a state without the state's permission. Those can be, or setting up refugee safe havens for refugees along the border, whatnot. Those are essentially nonviolent. You could also have coercive measures, for example, economic sanctions, arms embargoes, and the like, which can be very important measures, but are nothing like war fighting. And even with military measures, you can have many military measures that are far from the war-fighting forms of intervention, such as protecting those, sending in lightly armed troops to protect a aid corridor or a corridor that allows refugees to flee, or a safe haven along the border or something like that. So if you look at the wide variety of ways that you can intervene, then it doesn't become a simple question of, is there just cause for intervention? Should it be unilateral or multilateral? You would have different thresholds for the different kinds of interventions. So he argued you have to have a very high threshold for war-fighting type military interventions, which he didn't exclude. But that should be the last resort, the exceptional case. Most forms of humanitarian intervention should be the nonviolent or the coercive, various forms of coercive or military, but not war-fighting military interventions, and those would have a lower threshold for intervention. He also talked a lot about the legitimate authority question. He assumed that in most cases it should be the UN or some sort of relevant international body, legitimate international body, but in some cases when the UN Security Council, for example, and the Charter is not functioning, as it wasn't in Kosovo, and as it isn't now with respect to Ukraine, then other entities, other political entities could step in and make a decision, even unilateral intervention. I think Drew would have argued that in the case of Rwanda, it wouldn't have been immoral for the United States or some other party to intervene unilaterally in order to stop the genocide. So those are a couple of the points that Drew made. There's a lot more that can be said about humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect. But it was clear that he, if anybody questioned whether he had become a functional pacifist, his writings about humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect show that he still held open the possibility of the use of military force in exceptional circumstances.
And as was mentioned in the previous panel, he was always creatively looking to generate more options. So I appreciate the way you discussed this, not at all as a binary, but he saw these traditions as deeply and integrally united and many, many different ways to move forward for building peace. And so, Steve, I'm going to give you the very easy question then of telling us, given this multiplicity of paths to peace and the expansion of the paths to peace and the tradition that you described, what should we do in Ukraine? Or not do?
It's really, it's
Easy
quite
question,
simple.
easy
Yeah,
question.
easy question. Well, actually, Father Drew took up that question, used primarily the framework of responsibility to protect in laying out some initial thoughts on the situation, the tragedy really in Ukraine. And in beginning my own remarks on Ukraine, and I won't attribute all this to Drew now, but he was my mentor in many ways, I'll just say that. We have to begin first with the acknowledgement that too often just war norms have been used to justify war. We have to start with that. That said, my own belief is that Russia is waging an unjust war and Ukraine is waging a just defense, in my opinion. It's very significant that in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, just war is discussed in the section entitled Avoiding War. Avoiding war. All citizens, all governments are required to avoid war. And unfortunately, Russia didn't. Russia used military exercises as a fig leaf for its war preparations. Its consequent invasion of Ukraine is costing lasting, grave, and certain danger to the world order. And lasting, grave, and certain danger is one of the criteria, of course, of the just war tradition. Is there a lasting, grave, and sure? So I think it is morally licit, and I think Drew would argue this. It's morally licit for Ukraine to defend its citizens against aggression. I would also note that in many ways, Ukrainian citizens have, in areas, for example, that became occupied and so forth, they use nonviolent resistance as well. And Pax Christi has really documented a lot of that, and I think that's really important. At the same time, I think both Pope Francis and I think even Drew would argue, and Pope Francis in his trip back from Kazakhstan acknowledged this, that it is licit to assist Ukraine in its struggle with Russia, even to the extent of providing arms, although you have to be very careful about how that is done and what is done in that regard to stay, so that the situation doesn't escalate. I think just the fact that Ukraine was able to defend Kiev and has been able to push back and take additional territory, that there's some prospect for success. So there's some, but it's really important that we don't limit our response to simply, providing military equipment. We've got to help with displaced refugees. That's part of the responsibility to protect. Displaced people within Ukraine itself. At the same time, Ukraine must explore every reasonable, negotiable effort to end the war. Just because their defense is just doesn't mean that they don't have to consider any diplomatic channels, and we should be considering those. That responsibility actually falls even more directly on Russia itself. Russia is clearly the aggressor here, and their aggression does not mean that they can dispense with the obligation to avoid war, which unfortunately they initiated. Beyond the immediate conflict in Ukraine, I think it's really important that the West, our own nation, and Russia somehow don't allow us to fall into another Cold War as a result of this, and with the accompanying arms race that would go with it. And there's a lot of dangers in the current situation in Ukraine that could lead to escalations that would be morally damaging. And if it ever escalated to nuclear, it would be catastrophic for humanity. I think what we have to remember is that even Ukraine's just defense will not produce peace in the long run. What produces peace is working on human rights, working on building up the structures that enable people to reach their fulfillment, to building up the common good. I got the opportunity to travel to Ukraine before the first incursion of the Russians and this latest one. And they have in Kiev, they have this incredible monument to the sort of soaring spirit of the Ukrainian people. It's an angel uplifted. And humanity really needs to latch onto that soaring spirit. And I hope Drew is up there praying for us right now that we will find the spirit to move beyond war as a means of resolving conflict.
That's oh, go ahead, Jerry.
Can I just say,
Yeah.
I think there, yes, I think I agree. Drew would say that Ukraine is involved in a just defense, and then he would also be concerned about the risk of excessive arms flowing into a war zone, which is happening on all sides, and what risks that might create long-term, short-term and long-term for escalating the conflict, but also creating a regional conflict. But I think two other issues I think that Drew worked a lot on are relevant here. One is a nuclear question. We discussed this quite a bit yesterday, but one way to think about the church's approach to nuclear weapons is that the peace pastoral and the Cold War, the main issue was the ethics of use of nuclear weapons and ethics of deterrence. After the Cold War, the focus moved from that ethics of deterrence and use to an ethics of disarmament. And that's been the whole focus since the end of the Cold War for the Vatican, Drew's work, our Catholic Peacebuilding Project on nukes. It's been focused on the ethics of disarmament. But Ukraine brings us back, unfortunately, to a lot of the nuanced debates that we had around the ethics of use and deterrence in the 1980s with the peace pastoral and the like. So I think unfortunately, the peace pastoral is more relevant than it should be right now, because that was one of its main contributions was a very nuanced, detailed, sophisticated analysis of the ethics of use and deterrence. And I think that has now become relevant again. Secondly is, since the end of the Cold War, and even before, but especially since the end of the Cold War and the Harvest of Justice, this was a clear theme and a theme of all of Drew's writings, was the need to move toward human security or a cooperative security approach to international affairs. Get beyond this kind of collective security framework that was the defining approach during the Cold War. And the world did some important things after the end of the Cold War. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which Jim Goodby mentioned yesterday, made some progress in the 1990s and afterwards in bringing Europe together, both East and West, which was its purpose. And Jim Goodby says maybe OSCE could play a role in a peace agreement. But at the same time, we had the expansion of NATO, and that was a collective security model. And there are serious discussions about that did not justify in any way Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But there's a lot of disagreement, and there was at the time, of whether the expansion of NATO, this collective security model, was a good idea at the time, and whether it's still a good idea. And it certainly is concerning that last Thanksgiving, just about a year ago, Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, went to Germany because Germany had a new government, which is more social democrat, liberal government. They were concerned about whether Germany would continue to accept U.S. nukes on its territory. Stoltenberg reminded everybody in the audience in Germany that NATO is first and foremost a nuclear alliance, not just an alliance, but a nuclear alliance. And if Germany didn't want to accept nukes on its territory, then maybe we'd have to have nukes deployed farther east, which means on the border of Russia. So we need to keep that in mind, I think, as we think about Ukraine and continually to push for rethinking that collective security model and pushing the idea that, no, we need a different kind of model, which is a cooperative security model, if we're going to be able to get beyond the kind of conflicts we have in Russia and Ukraine right now.
And thanks, Jerry, for that mention, again, of the Challenge of Peace, which will be an anniversary year next year. So I'm sure many of our universities will be holding events expanding on that point of what are the applications of that to today, and expanding to ideas of peace building, human security, and cooperative security. Just to add on to your points about Ukraine, though, Steve, as we talk about responsibility to protect, I think it's also important to remember a responsibility for solidarity. And so all of the work that the various organizations are doing, whether it's Pax Christi, CRS, and others, to stay in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. As I'm here today, I'm not teaching my class right now, and so my students are holding another Zoom solidarity session with the Catholic University, the Ukrainian Catholic University students. So there are lots of ways that we can stay in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, not only at the governmental level. And I wanted to turn, Laurie, to the work that you've done in this mode of looking at the connections between these various strands of Drew's work, because you've done some wonderful work on the connections between environment and Catholic traditions on War and Peace. Jerry certainly has done that as well with a wonderful book with Caesar out on Catholic theology and mining and the concerns of the conflicts that can come in communities in mining. But you've also done some wonderful work in this area. I wonder if you could tell us about the connections between last panel and this panel, if you will.
Sure, happy to, because this is a really important nexus in Drew's work too. Several of us have mentioned the sort of increasingly restrictive approach to just war theory that you can see in Drew's thought and in the church's broader teaching. And one of the reasons for that increasing restrictiveness is a greater consciousness of the terrible environmental effects of war. So if we think about it in terms of the just war principle of proportionality, if you consider the environmental effects as one of the costs of war, it gives a much more complicated lens to assess proportionality. And I think you see this even in what Pope Francis has been saying recently, where he's not necessarily always making a moral argument about whether war is justified or not ever in any circumstances, but he's making an empirical argument and saying, if you take seriously the effects of modern warfare, if you look at war from the perspective of the wounded victims, he uses that phrase, if you look at the effects of war on the natural environment, and you genuinely account for all those negative effects, it makes it almost impossible to ever see war as a proportional response to an injustice, because those effects are so severe. But I do think this is perhaps the most difficult aspect of environmental ethics to deal with. It's enormous. I mean, we don't really know, but there's some estimates that about 30% of all carbon emissions today come from the world's militaries. But we don't know because, of course, governments tend to not be very, very transparent about what their militaries are doing, which also then makes it very difficult to hold them accountable for the carbon impacts of their militaries. It's also it's very difficult to convince people to let environmental concerns trump national security interests. Right? It's hard enough to talk to fossil fuel companies. Try talking to military leaders about making compromises. On the other hand, there are also some ways in which the US military, for instance, has been ahead of the game in this regard, right? Because they understand very clearly how climate change poses a security threat in a way that some political ideologues have not wanted to acknowledge, right? And so they're in some ways ahead of the game. Also, if you have a gas-guzzling tank that gets isolated out in the field, this is also not very helpful logistically, right? So looking for forms of green energy for military use actually can, I think, be then helpful in also developing technologies for civilian use, as ugly as that sounds in some ways. And then on the other hand, you mentioned not only thinking about the environmental effects of war, but also thinking about environmental problems as conflict drivers. We already heard about this terrible, climate conflict migration nexus that we're all too aware of. And so this book that we've done at CPN, which Drew's certainly been a big collaborator with, on the extractive industries as, in many cases, drivers of or sites of conflict that particularly impact indigenous people, women, some of the most poor and marginalized people in the world. This is an area where if you pay attention, you really hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor at the same time overlapping. And so it's something we've been trying to pay attention to. And it's something that especially is painful right now for us in the community of Sant'Egidio because we're seeing this in Mozambique, which is a country that's been really, dear to our hearts for a very long time, and which enjoyed relative peace for a long time since the peace accord in 1992, which Sant'Egidio had helped negotiate. But now there's been a discovery of incredible ruby deposits in the north of Mozambique. And as in many contexts, this is proving to be a real resource curse. That is also coupled with the impacts of climate change and flooding, and also is then creating migrant flows, and is also creating religious conflict, because like in many contexts where young people feel that there's little hope, a number of young people in Mozambique have turned to militant Islamist movements as something that gives them a vision for the future. So all of these, I think, are issues that challenge us to understand and articulate the connections between these issues better, and also connect to our spirituality, our theology in more deep ways. And this is something I've always found inspiring about Drew, that he's been able to move between really incisive policy analysis and then talk about peaceable virtues, right? Because this is so important. And one theological element that I feel like we need to think about in relationship to conflict and also the environment is a better eschatology. We don't often articulate the way in which our salvation as humans is interconnected also with the salvation of the earth, right? In the letter to the Romans, we read that all of creation is groaning in anticipation. And so when we dream about the peaceable kingdom, it's a peaceable kingdom that includes the entire cosmos. And we need to articulate that better to inspire environmental action as well.
A great way to sum of the connections between these themes we've been exploring. We're going to open it up for questions now from all of you who've been very patient, but I will warn the folks here that I am going to do a speed round before I turn it over to conclusions on asking a very speed round of what gives you hope. But in the meantime, let's open it up for questions from all of you. The microphones are here, and again, even though the acoustics are pretty good in this room, we're using the microphone for the recordings. And All our events have been recorded. We thank our video crew for your terrific work on this. And these will be posted at the Berkeley Center website for folks who were not able to be with us. And I know we've heard from many of our colleagues around the world, our co-conspirators, as Lori said, around the world, who are anxious to watch some of this online afterwards. But any questions or comments? John Borelli here.
Thank you. This is just a general question on the war in Ukraine. I think of the Ukrainians themselves have pretty much confined themselves to moving the Russians out of the siege territory. They did destroy a battleship in the Black Sea, and they did destroy a bridge. But what about the question of compensation and war crimes in ending the conflict? Isn't there a matter of justice there that the Ukrainians could plead for, but the Russians don't necessarily have to agree to end the conflict?
I think there's no doubt, there's just absolutely no doubt that the Russians have committed war crimes in Ukraine. I mean, they've been systematically documenting this. And will it be difficult to hold Russia accountable? Absolutely. Will the world attempt to hold Russia accountable? I think they will. Will this eventually seep into the consciousness of the Russian population to understand what has actually unfolded in Ukraine? I think ultimately it will have to. Early on in the conflict, I was very discouraged when I would hear about, having been to Ukraine, hearing about conversations that Ukrainians would have with their Russian relatives across the border, and they would say, Russia is bombing us, and their Russian neighbors would say, relatives would say, oh, no, we're liberating you. You're being taken over by Nazis and so forth. Ultimately, I don't think the propaganda machine will work. I think ultimately truth tends to gradually unfold. So I personally have hope that Russians will be held accountable. And incidentally, although they did damage the bridge, they didn't destroy it. And you're right that I think the U.S. has been clear with Ukraine not to use offensive weapons into Russian territory and so forth. And I think largely the Ukrainians have done that. They've primarily kept this a defensive operation.
And I know our colleagues at Ukrainian Catholic University had some sessions with Ukrainian members of the military to impress upon them the importance of adhering to international codes of conflict. Walt, I see you, and then Eli.
Hi, Walt Grazer. Can you talk a little bit about how peace building, peacemaking, right to protect whatever is complicated by arms sales, the increasing use of mercenaries and non-state actors in conflict?
Easy questions. Thank you, Walt.
We did a major document and major conference on the arms trade when Drew was at the conference. So we did try to deal with that question. We haven't dealt with that. The bishops haven't dealt with that question in as much detail and as consistently as they probably could. But we can't put everything on the bishops. It's the laity that ought to be taking the lead on these questions because they're the experts. They should be the experts. But the church, I mean, in general terms, has decried the arms trade in endless numbers of statements. But it's really a tough nut to crack because it's a huge industry and the like. And the privatization of militaries raises all kinds of concerns about the application of the laws of war and the like. And we ran into that in Iraq with the private, the inability to hold some of these contractors, hold them accountable for the crimes they committed, when they were under contract by the United States.
And the ironic thing about the arms races, the justification used for it, kind of arming and rearming and is, to provide, deterrence and to provide for peace. But in fact, it ends up, the vast sums of money that are spent on arms undermine the ability of us as a human family to address the basic injustices and needs that often lead to conflict. I love the phrase of the Second Vatican Council calling the arms race a treacherous trap for humanity, and rather than rather than promoting peace, it actually aggravates the causes of war because vast sums are simply wasted and aren't spent then on human needs that could address fundamental injustices and improve improve care for our creation and for our human family.
On the topic of private military groups, because Santa Didia is very involved in many contexts in Africa, we've been following the activities of the Wagner Group for some time. And I would note a couple of things about them. First of all, Russia got the idea from us to use private military groups in order to then avoid accountability. The Wagner Group is getting traction in African countries in many cases because the US, France, the West have failed in some substantial ways in their responsibilities. And so there's a vacuum there. Our short attention span when it comes to actually funding and taking seriously disarmament in a number of countries have left the field open. There are some very legitimate grievances that I find are not really well known, like the fact that in many Francophone West African countries, their federal reserves are still held by France. So it therefore has the power of the purse over anything those governments want to do, which, I mean, what a relic of colonialism. Why is it still that way? So addressing some of these broader injustices, I think, would go a long way to undermining the credibility that some of these groups are enjoying right now.
I think Eli was next in queue, and the good connection between the point Lori made previously about the need for peaceable virtues, or the importance of peaceable virtues. And of course, Eli has written a wonderful book on that, on just peace, virtue ethics. So we welcome your question, Eli.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. Good to see everybody. I'm just thinking back to Drew's contribution in Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace, where he says, the nonviolent ethic tradition is not just personal, but it can be used in the public sphere. So I'm curious if any of you have more reflections on how the nonviolence tradition, or the Just Peace framework, what that can contribute to the situation in Ukraine. What can it help us see or focus on? I mean, there are norms like, rehumanization. How do we help leaders rehumanize each other to minimize the violence? Supporting nonviolent resistance. We haven't, although it's happening, and we haven't heard a lot of how can we scale this up? How can we fund it, invest in it? Conflict transformation, right? What are the root causes of this thing? The war didn't begin in 2022. It began at least in 2014, and 7 years of counterterrorism and so forth. So what are your thoughts on what the nonviolence tradition, Just Peace framework can offer to kind of analyzing and breaking this cycle of violence in Ukraine?
So two very different ones. One is Drew really spent quite a bit of time thinking about creating an ethic of institutions, or creating just institutions. And that gets to my earlier point about cooperative security mechanisms, and the particular point about the OSCE, because that is the cooperative security mechanism in Europe. So I think Drew would say we just need a lot more attention to building those institutional structures that are necessary to promote cooperative security instead of, and get us out of the situation we're in. The second is very different, which goes back to the peaceable virtues. And that is forgiveness and reconciliation. Drew and Bill Bohl and Bob Hennemeyer, working here out of Woodstock at the time, did a really interesting book on the political ethic of forgiveness back in 2004. And that's, and forgiveness is one of many elements of a process of reconciliation. Accountability is another. There are a number of other elements, but forgiveness is one, and apology is, of course, related. And this has come up already in Ukraine. When the Vatican had the Good Friday services at the Colosseum this past year, there's a lot of controversy because they had two friends, one a Russian, one a Ukrainian, who participated in the Stations of the Cross. And a lot of people in Ukraine were outraged, including the Archbishop. Publicly said, this is inappropriate, the war's going on, we're dying by the day. Well, you can't talk about, this is just a silly act, it's actually a harmful act of reconciliation. I think that criticism was misplaced, because those who study processes of reconciliation generally say that, yes, there are certain elements that have to be done after the violence stops. Usually war crimes tribunals, accountability mechanisms happen after the violence stops. But in a lot of conflicts, forgiveness, reconciliation, apology, that happens before the violence starts, possibly. Certainly should happen during the violence, and it actually can help, alleviate some of the violence, as I think it did in Northern Ireland, where there are lots of cases individual cases where people offered apologies or forgiveness for, terrorist acts by the UK government, the police, or the IRA. And that really helped to calm the situation just a little bit. So I think that Drew probably would say, and I don't remember talking to him about this particularly, but, I couldn't have because he had already died. I'm getting my chronology wrong here, but which came first, Easter or Drew's death? But forgiveness and reconciliation, I think, will be a real challenge in Ukraine. And that's all about just peace, but it's got to happen. It's got to happen somehow over a long period of time, and it's got to start now. And there are some people at the Ukrainian Catholic University elsewhere in Ukraine who are thinking about this, and know that this has to happen now and begin to happen now. You have to begin to plan for that kind of thing. So those are two ways that you could bring in the just peace, I think.
We're at the end of our time, so I'm going to ask you whatever comments you have to integrate them with your final word on hope, and then we're going to go to our concluding remarks. So with either order.
Hope. What gives me hope? I'm going to answer the question and share some hope. What gives me hope? When I was in Ukraine, I saw the absolutely vibrant civil society there. And I believe that in the process of rebuilding, in the wake of conflict, which hopefully will end sooner rather than later, there will be tremendous hope, because people will come together, they will rebuild, and hopefully they're going to build back better. I also believe that Russia will be impacted by this, that Russian civil society will learn from this experience when all the dust settles and the truth gradually filters through. And that always gives me hope.
One thing that gave me hope just recently was a massive peace march that took place in Rome. And it gave me hope partly because I found that in listening to some of the interviews with people who were marching and the organizers, they were able to talk about it in a nuanced way, right? Marching for peace right now can look very problematic from the perspective of some Ukrainians, right? But they were able to say, look, we have to somehow envision a shared future. This gets at your question, I think, Eli. How do we think far into the future, knowing that there's going to have to be some form of coexistence? Okay, yes, there need to be reparations, perhaps, questions of justice dealt with, but what does that long-term future look like? And I would point out that a lot of young, educated Russians have left the country. There are, of course, a lot of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine right now. So where are the venues in which young people on both sides can talk about what they envision for a long-term future. Those are things that we on the outside of this conflict might be able to convene. And those are the conversations that in the long run, I think will contribute to a just peace.
They say war is hell. If that's true, there are a lot of saints in hell. We see this with the Catholic Peace Building Network. We really are fortunate to work with, engage with, I would call them Catholic peace building saints around the world in places like South Sudan and Mindanao in the southern Philippines and Colombia and elsewhere. There are all kinds of people, many we will never know about, who are just working at the very local level, and others who are well known, the work of San Egidio, for example. But it really is amazing what the Catholic community around the world is doing to promote peace in every different way in all these different conflicts. And that's what gives me hope, is seeing these amazing peace-building saints that are out there all over the place.
Including Jerry in his work as director of the Catholic Peace Building
it's
Network.
a little presumptuous.
And check out the website for more resources, because there's all these different peace communities that Jerry's referencing, the resources from these different organizations on their fine website. I want to ask you to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their remarks and their wisdom today. And we are now at our conclusions. So we are going to have concluding remarks from Jerry and myself, and then from Tom Banchoff will be the final. So, and then we do understand we are the last thing standing between you and lunch, so we will keep ourselves brief. Yes, between us and lunch. And I did mention before that all of these remarks have been recorded, so definitely check back. Probably, what do you think, Tom, about a week or so is the usual turnaround time, and these will be posted on the Georgetown Berkeley Center website. So, want to go first? Because Tom wanted to go last.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we're talking about carrying forward Drew's legacy, so I figured I would just remind you about some of the ideas that have come up in the last couple of days, and this is not meant to be exhaustive, but it's just a few ideas that people have offered for how to carry Drew's legacy forward. So Jim Goodby suggested that be some sort of track 2 process that would strengthen the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's role in promoting peace in Ukraine. Jonathan Granoff and Aaron Loos both suggested the Catholic institutions should focus on divestment. Jonathan from divestment in indiscriminate weapons, and Aaron divestment from fossil fuel companies. Doug Shaw and the Nuclear Threat Initiative talked about the need for a Catholic disarmament network. Daryl Kimball talked about the need to support a new START agreement. Otherwise, we'll be left with no nuclear arms control agreements between the United States and Russia for the first time since '72. Greg Thielman talked about the need for a no first use nuclear policy. Sorry, I'm focusing a lot on nuclear weapons, but that was 2 panels. Bill Barbieri talked about building bridges within the church around a whole lot of issues that are dividing the Catholic community. Walt Grazer talked about continuing to work at the parish level on concrete issues of environmental justice, and that fits very well with what Drew had talked about. And that's just some of the ideas that were offered. There are many others. How about you?
So we've spent 2 days, and we'll have also invite you again tomorrow night on November 16th at Dahlgreen Chapel at 7 p.m. Will be the first inaugural Drew Christensen Memorial Lecture, so we can continue this conversation. But over these 3 days, we've discussed a lot about what Drew's contributions have been in the past on a variety of different issue areas, and at break, Mary Moran, one of our participants here, has said, what about Drew's work on China? And others have said, what about Drew's work in the former Yugoslavia? So we could have done many more panels on many more aspects of Drew's work because he did have such a rich legacy. So we've talked about his contributions in the past. We've talked about their implications for the present on all of these policy issues, these very, very critical policy issues that we face today. But the point of this conference is how to take the legacy forward. What this means, this legacy means going forward to the future. So certainly the scholarship all has implications for moving forward. We've also talked about policy prescriptions to move forward on these various policy and advocacy avenues going forward. But I think Drew's, one of his most critical contributions was the way we do it, the process for moving forward as community. He loved to say, and said often, that we think of moral questions as being questions of either or. They are not questions of either or. They are questions of or and or and or and or. That there are many paths to get to meeting, many paths to be able to meet our moral obligations. And we don't decide that alone. While it's very important to have a personal spiritual life and to have personal routes of discernment, we discern this together. So when I said yesterday that all of us are Drew Christensen's legacy, that's what I was referring to, his building of intentional communities, his building of intentional relationships, his concept of the moral imagination was that we had to imagine communities that included our adversaries, whether it was adversaries in areas of war and peace, or adversaries on different sides of the aisle or different political perspectives who had different ideas, that we had to have encounter with them, with people from different perspectives. We had to engage them in dialogue. And we didn't do this just because of kind of a PC idea that it would be good to engage people with different views and voices. We did this because this is how moral discernment works. And that by doing that, by creating these intentional communities of moral dialogue and moral discernment, that is where we met each other in relationships of love and friendship. We built these relationships of love and friendship, and out of these relationships and love and friendship would spring new and creative ideas for paths forward. There wasn't a one path to peace. He would have had a very short legacy if he thought there was just one path. There are multiple paths, and we have to grow and discern and nurture and water all of these paths, and we do this work together. So when we talk about carrying forward Drew's legacy, it's also carrying forward these networks, these relationships, these connections that he has built. I hope in the time together we've spent, we've had some opportunities to have conversations and cross-fertilizations across, the nuclear weapons folks, the environmental justice folks, the interreligious peace-building folks, and we can carry those networks and those connections forward, moving forward together. One final point, and all of us have mentioned this, is how he maintained his upward, ebullient, positive way of looking at the world, while simultaneously dealing with some of the most disturbing and difficult world problems. I've joked to Jerry before, you couldn't pick a more difficult problem set than some of the issues that Drew chose. We heard from Jeff Aboud this morning, many people avert their eyes at the questions of inclusiveness in the Holy Land and Middle East peace because the problem set is too difficult. And Drew did not avert his eyes to these difficult problem sets, whether it was peace in the Middle East, nuclear disarmament, or climate change and environmental justice. So how did he keep his hope while dealing with these very, very difficult and intransigent, some of the world's kind of most hopeless causes, some might argue? And he did this because of his deep faith. He did not believe he was addressing these issues alone. He was addressing them with the power of his faith in his God, and he was addressing it together with all of us, with these communities of dialogue and moral discernment that he worked so hard on building. So from that very deep bedrock of faith, he believed all that was required, and all of that's required of any of us, is to bring our simple gifts of loaves and fishes to come together and to trust that nothing is impossible with God. And I think that is the way we carry Drew's legacy forward. But I want to thank you all for participating in this, and I want to invite Tom, our fearless leader here from the Berkeley Center and Georgetown. I want to thank him for his sponsorship and leadership in this, and invite him to have our closing remarks today.
Well, thanks. That's very kind and overly generous, really. You've done remarkable work, Mary Ann and Jerry, and those are beautiful remarks, really summarizing what's been an excellent gathering. And as you suggested, and as we've embedded in the title of the conference, a work in progress. Drew left us too soon. He worked in so many different areas, gave us so much to think about going forward. And I just had a few thoughts, really building on some of your reflections, I hope. But before I forget, I do want to thank you both, Michael Kessler of the Berkeley Center, for your leadership in bringing us together, kind of wearing both of my hats as Berkeley Center Director and as VP for Global Engagement, say how much the work with the Catholic Peace Building Network means to us, meant to Drew, and we look forward to pushing all of that work forward. Now, because our friend Drew was so versatile, we've covered a lot of ground. You've covered a lot of ground over the last couple of days. We know his expertise is far and wide. You can't have a longer title, really, for a conference than this, although you could have added China and many other things. He touched so many communities, from his students and his colleagues to the church, to government officials, to a wider public. And I think you know, because you knew him, those of you who knew him personally, he was a beloved colleague here at Georgetown and at the Berkeley Center. It's been alluded to a couple of times. He really worked right up to the end. I had a chance to meet with him just a week before he passed away. He was part of the Culture of Encounter project. And I just want to quote something from one of the last, we can debate what was the last thing he wrote, right? Because he was so prolific right up into the end. But he wrote an essay, a beautiful essay, for that project about the gentle virtues and the common good. An essay that really brought together the ethical and the political, two things that Drew held together in his person so beautifully. Now, in this essay, he elaborates the gentle virtues, and we can all think of Drew. This is what he wrote. Qualities like hospitality, receptivity, listening, attentiveness, appreciation, kindness, reverence, self-effacement, and service, unquote. So for me, that reads as a sort of self-portrait. And he concludes his essay, I use the present tense, he concludes his essay with a sentence that bridges really between the personal, the ethical, and the political. Quote, "The gentle virtues hold the promise of reconciling diversity in service to the universal common good," unquote. So we remember and celebrate Drew as intellectual contributions, but also as gentle virtues, his enduring service to the universal common good as a scholar, teacher, a practitioner, and a priest for the greater glory of God. So we're at the end of our time together here. We want to continue to be engaged across these various agendas. And like you, I want to recognize some of the folks who made this possible, in particular, my colleagues in the Berkeley Center, Imogene Johnson and Amy Vanderfleet, and the rest of the Berkeley team. If you could give them a hand. We're coming out of the pandemic. I'm not allowed to say the pandemic's over. It's not over. But coming out of the pandemic, it's great to be together. And these in-person gatherings, as you know, are complex undertakings. So thank you, Imogene and Amy, for your leadership. Thank you all for being here. And let's continue this work together on the issues Drew cared so passionately about inspired by him, but also learning from one another as he would have wanted, as he wants, carrying forward his legacy, a living legacy into the future. So thanks for joining us.